natural selection doesn't optimize for happiness or well-being or kindness or any of the virtues. It simply optimizes for the inclusive fitness of our genes. So all kinds of nasty human behaviors, thoughts and feelings, from jealousy to depression, resentment, aggressive warfare, sexual coercion, they were adaptive in the ancestral environment. And yeah, we're only here because some of our ancestors did terrible things, but we're on the brink of a reproductive revolution, and the nature of selection pressure changes when intelligent agents choose the genetic makeup of their offspring in anticipation of the likely behavioral and psychological effects of their choices. And I think we need to edit our genetic source code, devise a new signaling system, replace the traditional pleasure pain axis with all its horrors with, crudely, a pleasure super pleasure axis. Life should be based on gradients of intelligent bliss. And if that sounds a bit sci-fi, it's worth studying today's hedonic outliers. Just as tragically some people go through life animated by gradients of ill-being, there are a few people, like my transhumanist colleague Anders Sandberg, who says, yes, I do have a ridiculously high hedonic set point. The medical technical name for this is hyperthymia. I think we ought to create an entire hyperthymic civilization, and indeed an entire hyperthymic biosphere. What lies beyond that is speculative. I think we'll go on to create gradients of superhuman bliss. First of all, let's fix the problem of suffering.
I think people hear this idea of like abolishing suffering, and the first thing that comes to my mind, at least, is isn't some amount of suffering good?
Suffering, mental and physical pain, can be instructive. The question to ask is not whether it can sometimes be instructive or have a functional role, but rather whether it is functionally indispensable. And if you look at our intelligent machines, I've been as blown away by the Transformer revolution as anyone. But essentially, machines can now cognitively outperform humans in most domains, and they can do so without the ghastly raw feels of suffering. Now, there are two options if we want to fix suffering. They're not mutually exclusive. One, which I touched on just now, was information sensitive gradients of bliss. The other is offloading various functions to smart prostheses, and they're not mutually exclusive. However, some people don't want to become cyborgs, so we could just aim for information sensitive gradients of bliss. I stress it's a bit of a mouthful. The information sensitive, the dips, so to speak, can play the functional role of suffering, but without the nasty raw feels.
So it's like if we had the suffering, but replaced the actual feeling of suffering with some other mechanical signal, like say like a tapping on your hand or something like that.
Yes, I mean, one possibility would be, yeah, it's the cyborg route that, uh, that if your hand were on a hot stove, essentially it was automatically we, withdrawn by a neuroprosthesis. Presumably, one would want some kind of manual override, so you didn't feel you'd lost control of your body. I mean, the more conservative option is ensure that, and this is, as I said, the conservative option is to ratchet up hedonic range and pain tolerance. If you've ever met someone who says something like, "Oh, pain, it's just a useful signaling system," pain sensitivity varies from congenital insensitivity to pain, which we don't want because it also abolishes nociception, to people who have an extremely high pain tolerance, pain threshold, to at the other extreme, people who are incredibly sensitive to pain and suffer a great deal. And if we are willing to embrace genome reform, all prospective parents can be offered, for example, the SCN9A gene, the volume knob for pain. Nonsense mutations induce congenital insensitivity to pain, but there are dozens of other alleles. At the other end, there are those, something like man on fire syndrome, incredible pain sensitivity. But if we give our kids a perfectly functional but benign version of the SCN9A gene, they're not going to be troubled by pain, but it'll still preserve its signaling mechanism. That would be a conservative approach. Essentially, if we are prepared to intervene and offer all prospective parents access to pre-implantation screening, counseling, and CRISPR genome editing, it's possible to give children high hedonic set points, so they're temperamentally extremely happy. Also, high pain thresholds, so they're not going to be unduly troubled by pain. There are countless complications we can go into, but that's the basic idea. If it all sounds experimental and untested, well, it is, but so is bringing any new baby via sexual reproduction into the world. Antinatalists would say it is not morally justified to create immense involuntary suffering, which is what one is doing by bringing new life into the world. I very much respect this view, but not having children simply imposes selection pressure in favor of being against being child free. So the future belongs to life lovers. I focus on essentially trying to persuade prospective parents that this is the right thing to do. Already now in the United States, there are embryo screening companies, but their focus tends to be on IQ, the standard measure of general intelligence. But I think we need a happy baby company which focuses on subjective well-being.
So a couple of things. I mean, first, as a fellow life lover myself, I would like
Good.
to, I'd like to say, I mean, do you know the Anna Karenina principle from that book by Tolstoy?
Tell me more.
It's all happy families are the same.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Feels like all happy families are the same for those who don't know, but all unhappy families are unhappy in their own ways. And
Mm-hmm.
so what this means is there's only one way to get, like, not one way to get to happiness, but if you imagine like knobs, right, on like different axes of our life, like let's say your spiritual happiness runs from 1 to 10, your emotional happiness runs from 1 to 10, your physical happiness runs from 1 to 10, like your happiness about all these things runs from 1 to 10. There's only select few configurations will lead to happiness, right? Like, let's say each of those being between 8 to 10 versus the other, like, or 7 to 10 versus the other, like, 1 to 6, I would say.
Mm.
And so it feels that having that unhappiness, suffering, it sounds kind of sad, but it also leads to a lot of depth in literature and in life. I also wonder if having, because I don't know anything about, what is it,
Hypothermia.
hyperthymia. It does having that, like, for example, let's say normally your pain pleasure axis runs from like minus 100 to plus 100, where minus 100 is like very in severe pain and plus 100 is like pure bliss. If we shifted that to say like minus 10 to plus 100, then wouldn't being at like a 50 be the same as being at whatever, like a minus 60? I don't know.
I mean, some people intuitively feel that pleasure and pain are mostly relative, but they're not. I mean, standardly, I give this, the example of today, pleasure pain axis stretches from, this is schematically, minus 10 to 0, emotionally neutral experience, to plus 10. And essentially, by calling for a more civilized signaling system, I'm saying that we should ratchet up hedonic range and hedonic set points. And it's possible to have, let's say, a 70 to a plus 100 civilization. And in one sense, there's an immense gulf between the plus 100, which is inconceivably sublime, and the lower depths of the plus 70. but that plus 70, the hedonic floor of that of a future civilization surpasses our hedonic ceiling. And yeah, as a civilization, I think we ought to be ratcheting up hedonic range and hedonic set points. Importantly, ratcheting up your hedonic set point doesn't it can leave your preference architecture, your values, your relationships intact. I mean, this is optional. I mean, not a simple example. Just imagine waking up tomorrow in an extraordinarily good mood. It isn't going to, by itself, change your relationships or values. And this neutrality is worth stressing because I'm not trying to sell anyone my personal vision of paradise. I'm just urging people to improve their quality of life and the quality of life of any sentient being they create.
So you don't think this is something that like we could put in as like a policy, more something that once it becomes available or something that will become available, you would personally do and you would urge people to do.
Yes, I mean, if you look at the World Health Organization definition of health, complete physical, emotional, social well-being, that could only be achieved via genome reform. By the WHO criterion, no sentient being in history has ever yet been healthy. In that sense, what I'm urging, which is life based on information sensitive gradients of bliss, is less radical than complete health as defined by the WHO. It's worth stressing no one is going to force you to be happy. The question is when suffering of any kind becomes optional, has one any right to expect others to undergo involuntary suffering? Power creates complicity.
Speaking of power, I also think that having like a small reducing the amount of pain you could experience and increasing your pleasure sensitivity while decreasing your pain sensitivity. If you look at what's happening in America right now with Donald Trump, I mean it brings people, myself included, a lot of like mental suffering. Hearing about all these horrible things happening in like ICE detention centers and just around the world in general. And even though it hurts to suffer like this, I think that if I had like a lower pain tolerance, mental pain tolerance for mental suffering, then maybe I would be able to sort of ignore it. I'd be able to be like, "Oh yeah, that's just the pain signal." And so I wouldn't be as motivated to, and I think a lot of people wouldn't be more motivated to act because I think most people base their beliefs, their actions, and a lot of things just off their feelings.
Uh-huh. You, One might imagine that the happiest people would be lotus eaters and become indifferent to the suffering of the world. But typically, actually, the happiest people tend to have the most desires and the strongest motivation. This rather goes against Buddhism. By contrast, people who experience suffering, their own, they're empathetic, the suffering of others, they become depressed. Low mood is disempowering. The recipe for active citizens is to ratchet up crudely hedonic range and hedonic set point. One of the theories as to why depression is so common is that it's an adaptation. It's associated with subordination, defeat, keeping one's head down. It's the kind of internalized correlate of the losing subroutine. And low mood, tragically, is very, very common, both clinical and subclinical depression. And it probably has this kind of evolutionary explanation. And yeah, by actually ratcheting up hedonic set point, people would probably be more prone to challenge authority and become active citizens. This is the opposite of the Huxley Brave New World objection, in which Soma is used to pacify the lower orders, keep them very happy. Whereas if you look, who are the people who are most active in protests? They're not depressives. They're people with, a fully functioning reward circuitry, shall we say.
I also want to hear what you were going to say about the like the added how suffering sort of adds depth to our experiences. Like, um, I having suffered a lot in the past, also I think makes one more grateful for their present, and also that is what I think creates beliefs and creates value systems in the first place. How being forced to wrestle with like, who am I? How do I know what I know, and how do I know if it's true? These are uncomfortable and often emotionally disorienting questions, and they could result in for a lot of people, mental suffering. And at the same time, though, I feel that they add a sort of depth to one's experience.
Yeah, so I gave the example of this a range of plus 70 to a plus 100. So a larger hedonic range than is physiologically feasible today. Um, One common criticism of the abolitionist project is that what is important is meaning, significance. Yet, if you look, other things being equal, ratcheting up your hedonic range, hedonic set point, makes life more meaningful and significant. Conversely, people with low mood and depression, life begins to feel empty. They become anhedonic. It drains life of pleasure. Everything seems meaningless, and this can shade, sadly, into the nihilistic despair of severe depression. So, if we want a world with more meaning and more significance, I know it sounds crass, but the route is to create the substrates of pleasure. And if I think of future civilization, it won't just be orders of magnitude happier than is physiologically feasible today. Life will seem orders of magnitude more significant. Now, this is counterintuitive.
Yeah, I mean, I saw this study where they asked people like, "Are you a?" There was like a survey, and they had two questions, or it was like one question, and it was like, "Would you say you're a giver, or would you say you're a receiver? Would you say you like to give, or do you like to take?" And the people who responded with that they like to give, as in like they like to donate to charity and whatnot, and give things to people, reported lower happiness, but higher senses of well-being and higher like meaning. And the people who said, I like to receive, to take things and to bring things into my world and to like hoard almost, reported higher happiness but lower meaning. And so I don't know about like how correlated meaning and happiness are, but surely it could be that somebody could be very happy. Like it could be the case that someone could be very happy but have very low sense of meaning. I feel like it's very difficult to make a blanket statement like that.
Does anyone ever say, feel extremely happy, but my life feels empty and meaningless? I mean, by its very nature, intense happiness feels extraordinarily meaningful. I mean, take Dostoevsky, who had ecstatic epileptic seizures, and Prince Michigan. I mean, he says, I would give my whole life for this one instance. Intense happiness feels extraordinarily meaningful. But yeah, in terms of what kind of well-being, one can imagine well-being like MDMA, ecstasy. People, sadly, the effect is short-lived, but people who take MDMA, popularly known as ecstasy, experience not just intense pleasure, but intense love, empathy, kindness, and warmth. And one possibility for civilization is giving people the option of being in lifelong MDMA-like states. We don't yet know how to do it, though there are some tantalizing clues. Rather than prescribing one particular kind of happy consciousness, I just focus on the general principle that we ought to eliminate experience below hedonic zero, enjoy life but animated by gradients of bliss. What we actually choose to be blissful about, and as spiritual people, Once we identify the molecular signature of spiritual experience, it'll be possible to refine it, purify it, amplify it, enjoy lifelong spiritual ecstasies. For people who focus on the arts, it'll be possible to identify the molecular signature of aesthetic beauty. Again, refine, amplify, purify, and everyday life can be more sublimely beautiful than anything we can physiologically imagine.
You mentioned MDMA, and I think a topic I actually haven't covered on this channel is psychedelics. What do you think about those? I mean, do you have any particular take on like their meaning like philosophically?
The only way that we're ever going to be able to understand consciousness, I think, is to pursue the experimental method. However, I'm very cautious when it comes to urging people to explore because dark Darwinian minds have such nastiness, darkness lying within, and the effects of psychedelics are extremely unpredictable. If one listens to people who have taken psychedelics, on the whole, rare exceptions aside, it's not very impressive. Often they will babble nonsense or alternatively talk about the ineffable and the inconceivable. That said, I think the enterprise of knowledge has scarcely begun. Billions of alien state spaces of experience as different as waking from dreaming consciousness await discovery, and some of them are extremely profound. I can give this little analogy, if you like. Imagine a tribe of congenitally blind rationalists, and someone takes a drug that induces what we would call visual experiences. It doesn't create sensory apparatus, retina, or anything like that. It just induces visual experiences. And this drug taker is convinced that this is profoundly significant. And we can say, well, yes, actually, you know, he's right. But he says that, look, it's to the blind rationalists, the intellectuals of the tribe. He says that it's inexpressible, ineffable, that, well, yes, red is somehow what we would call red is somehow similar to loud sounds. But the elders of the tribe are very unimpressed. I mean, the drug taker doesn't go on to, produce beautiful symphonies or anything like that. He just babbles about the ineffable and the inexpressible. And that is my analogy for drug taking, that yes, it gives one a window into these alien realms, but such is the nature of language. I don't know if you're familiar with uh, Wittgenstein's anti-private language argument. Essentially, yeah, these states, we don't have the vocabulary to express what's going on. And so they are unlikely to lead if someone takes them to any great obvious breakthrough that can be communicated to the rest of the world, and yet at the same time, these alien states give us a hint of what lies ahead. Now, this all important proviso, though, I don't think we should explore psychedelia until we have got our reward circuitry sorted out, because frequently these outlandish state spaces of consciousness can have an extreme intensity. Fantastic if you have a mystical epiphany or something, but yeah, bad trips are an ever present possibility. So, extreme caution, I would urge.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I love the metaphor you used with the tribe members. I think it's also really interesting. Aldous Huxley. I don't know how to pronounce it. I've only seen it written down. Um, did I think mescaline, and he wrote about it. And since he's such like an articulate person, obviously he was able to describe it in great detail. And I think that's very interesting. Like you said, I think it kind of depends on the user. Like somebody who's very articulate may be able to describe the experience much better than, say, the average person on the street. And so I think it's it's interesting. We see like with Gen Z a reemergence of like the countercultural movement in the 1960s, and like very similar stuff is going on. Especially a lot of people in Gen Z are very interested in psychedelia. Why do you think that might be?
Essentially, it is absolutely fascinating, the existence of realms completely beyond everyday consciousness. What we think of as everyday consciousness is just this tiny little sliver amongst billions, trillions of alien state spaces awaiting discovery. And anyone who is intellectually curious is going to want to find out more. But though some of these state spaces do lend themselves to description of sorts, many of them don't. And if one doesn't have the concepts or the vocabulary to describe an experience, what does one do? So yeah, in the case of fundamental physics, the most extreme conditions tell us most about the universe. And that's why physicists, as you know, build particle accelerators costing, millions of dollars trying to get to super high energies. And I suspect this is true of consciousness too, that although even if one thinks one is having a profound mystical experience, one is probably just dabbling in the paddling pool end of psychedelia. And some of the stuff is inconceivably crazy. And I can say inconceivably crazy without understanding the implications of what I am saying. And last century, my ancestral namesake was a psychonaut and did explore some alien state spaces, but a lot of the time I found the experiences were just too alien to put into words.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's very interesting. I guess also I meant more so, by the way, why do you think Gen Z is trending towards not only psychedelia, but a lot of the same patterns of the baby boomers and just the countercultural movement of the 60s? Like the social justice and going for like creating a sort of alternative culture. Is this just like what teenagers do? Or is there something unique about Gen Z that they had in common, that we have in common with
I suspect you're probably more of an authority on this than me, let's say. I don't have an off the cuff. I mean, I'm not especially aware of different generations, whereas possibly you are. I probably speak a lot of the time using vocabulary more common in the last century and stuff like that. As a transhumanist, I look forward to the day when we don't think in terms of generations. But yes, sadly today they are real, and we can't yet fix the problem of aging.
Do you think one day we will be able to reach some sort of immortality?
Indefinite lifespans is different from immortality. If we didn't age, I think it's been estimated that unless one takes undue care, one's longevity would be about 600 years, accidents and so forth. But yeah, I think we will fix the problem of aging. As a transhumanist, I believe in a triple S civilization of super longevity, super intelligence, and super happiness. There is the option of cryonics for people cryothanasia for people who recognize they aren't going to make it. In the case of timescales, I've been disoriented in that, uh, I mean, no one anticipated the transformer revolution in AI, and my timescales for various utopian scenarios have shifted. In the hedonistic imperative, I gave an estimate. The world's last experience below hedonic zero would probably be, yeah, it's a few hundred years from now, perhaps some obscure marine invertebrate. But in theory, with AI, one could accelerate this. I mean, sadly, this isn't a prediction, but it would be technically feasible. I mean, it'd be wonderful, you see, if we had 100-year plan to fix the problem of suffering, and it would be technically feasible. However, to succeed, we would need to persuade all prospective parents to edit the genetic source code of their future offspring, which is going to be a challenge.
Yeah, and I mean, it does seem, I don't know if you addressed this in the hedonic imperative, but it does seem, I could imagine it being like a very slippery slope into eugenics.
Strictly, it is eugenics. But yeah, I mean, the well-being of all sentients was not a tenet of National Socialism. That the word eugenics itself is irreparably tainted by 20th century history. But yeah, I think one has an obligation if one is going to create new life to load the genetic dice in favor of one's future offspring. And yeah, one can use the E word, but if we don't do what I'm urging, then horrific pain, mental and physical pain, will proliferate indefinitely. I'm sounding like a very crude genetic determinist obsessed with genome reform. There are other ways to tackle the problem of suffering that don't involve genetics at all. We've got to shut outlaw factory farms and slaughterhouses. But if we are ethically serious about fixing the problem of suffering, we need to essentially edit the animal kingdom. And we now have extraordinarily powerful tools that it will shortly enable us to reprogram the biosphere. When I wrote The Hedonistic Imperative 30 years ago, I just couldn't have conceived of CRISPR-based synthetic gene drives that cheat the laws of Mendelian inheritance. For example, I mentioned earlier the so-called volume knob for pain, the SCN9A gene. If we wanted to, we could spread benign versions of the SCN9A gene across, thousands of species with these kind of genetic tools. And ubiquitous AI conjures up, for some people, dystopian scenarios, but could also be used for a pan-species welfare state and what I sometimes call high-tech Jainism, that every cubic meter of the biosphere will shortly be accessible to surveillance, micromanagement, and control. And I think we have an obligation to get rid of involuntary suffering.
Interesting. And so you're vegan, right?
Yes, yeah.
Do you think that I mean, I assume you think that everybody has an obligation to go vegan.
Yes, I mean there are slight complications. It is very easy to be a vegetarian, and a plant-based diet is associated with lower all-cause mortality. Some people have problems going vegan. There are ways around this. I mean, not even all Jains. Jains are incredibly strict when it comes to animal rights. They're not all vegan, but crudely, I think sentient beings shouldn't harm each other, that the non-humans in factory farms and slaughterhouses, they're akin to small children, and we have an obligation to help sentient beings rather than harm them. And it doesn't involve heroic self-sacrifice. That's as I yeah. On the
Yeah.
contrary, it seems to have health benefits.
Yeah, I actually did try to go vegan. I went vegan for like 3 months,
Hmm.
and then I went off the diet because like I wasn't getting enough protein, and then I went back on the diet, and then I went off it, and then I went back on, and then I've been kind of alternating ever since. I think a lot of people have like trouble like maintaining it, even though it's the right thing to do.
Yes, I mean some people feel better on a vegan diet. They say they report they feel calmer. Others have problems shifting. I actually urge anyone who does have problems on a vegan diet to start the day with a truly ethically sourced egg and a fruit juice. So you're getting essentially meat, but in theory, at any rate, no cruelty. So a lot of the stuff that is called free range isn't, and involves cruelty and killing spent hens and things like that. But if one wants to do the right thing, I'm not the kind of vegan who, who's eating out will check the kitchens or anything like that. The greatest source of severe, readily avoidable suffering in the world is animal agriculture. And before exploring more exotic scenarios, and I do explore the exotic scenarios like, yeah, getting rid of wild animal suffering, we just have to stop harming other sentient beings. And, you can say something like a pig is as sentient as a toddler. but not really appreciate just the full horror of what this statement involves. Because, humans routinely do things to non-human animals that would get the perpetrators locked up for life if the victims were human. And as it George Bernard Shaw, custom will reconcile people to any atrocity. Yeah, what we're doing, I think, is evil beyond, yeah, evil beyond belief. Yeah.
Why do people, I mean, it seems to me that a lot of people don't know about the suffering of animals and they don't know about how bad, like true, like you said, like the emotional gravitas of what they're doing by eating animals because they just don't know. But of the people who do know, I wonder is why, there are people who could look at this animal like suffering and just say like, yeah, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, for evolutionary reasons, capacity for empathy is selective. It's not impartial concern for the well-being of all sentients. One tends to be empathetic towards friends, family, companion animals. So, I mean, I think a lot of people probably imagine they're eating the equivalent of roadkill. And, it's dead. It's there. Everyone else is doing it. So, uh, yeah. So, the actual mechanics of animal agriculture and the actual kind of factory farms and slaughterhouses, they're hidden. And, most people just do not want to know. There was a poll recently, and I still don't believe it, that said 47% of Americans would favor closing slaughterhouses. Now that strikes me as absurd, but even if it's 20%, I mean, there's people, this disconnect. They're imagining kind of evil people running slaughterhouses. Yeah, absurd. Realistically, I think the way to get animal agriculture ended is by cultured meat, farm-free animal products. They could be genetically engineered for improved taste and flavor, but better to not to genetically engineer them, advertise them as naturally inspired, unlike the products of factory farming. And I think people are most likely to appreciate the moral arguments for ending animal agriculture when it involves zero personal inconvenience.
Yeah.
And that's why I think, we should accelerate the development of cultured meat, farm-free animal products.
Yeah, what do you think about Peter Singer? I mean, have you read what's it called, that his essay about the with the analogy of the drowning child?
Yes, I mean they say don't meet your heroes, but actually having met Peter Singer, I was on stage with him in Melbourne. Yeah, he's a wonderful guy, and he's always had a sense of he knows how far to go and not further. And arguably, many people would say I go too far with phasing out predation, getting rid of suffering in nature. The problem of predation has recently gained a certain traction. First academic paper published on ending predation. There is a small group of activists who do focus on the topic. Chatted to Peter Singer about it. First, he was quite dubious, but I think he's shifted his position. But I think one day the idea that sentient beings shouldn't harm each other will be axiomatic.
Yeah.
Um,
Because I ask because I think people find Peter Singer's ideas so counterintuitive. I mean, I think lab cultured meat is also super interesting because I think it definitely is one of the next steps. I mean, if you look at like these papers recently that they're publishing with like lab cultured meat, I mean, it's going really far. And I think because of what Peter Singer's analogy with like, it's much easier to save a drowning child in front of you, even if you got your $200 pants wet,
mhm, mhm.
versus donating $200 to malaria nets to children in Africa. I think a lot of people feel more of an obligation, everyone feels more of an obligation to the drowning child in front of them because of what you said, personal inconvenience. And so I guess that's why I brought up Peter Singer. It made me think of that drowning child analogy.
Mhm. Yes, it's a good analogy. I mean the book that really changed minds of a lot of people was Animal Liberation. That's is it set 1970? It's now quite old, But in its day, it was truly radical and sensational. Yeah.
Interesting. I have a couple last questions before I set you free. What would you give for as advice for, I guess, me and a lot of the people watching this who are either newer to philosophy or just like people being human?
Advice. If one is an elephant and in one's 50s or 60s, then you're generally a very wise elephant. But in the case of humans, the pace of change is so fast that life candidly baffles me. I mean, I offer answers to everything from the hard problem of consciousness, a phenomenal binding problem, and why our machines aren't going to wake up, a problem of causal efficacy, and yet I don't have an explanation of consciousness, which I suspect discloses the intrinsic nature of the physical, either its existence or its diverse phenomenal properties. And so it baffles me. So those studying philosophy may enable you to talk a lot about these problems. Yeah, I think we've scarcely scratched the surface of knowledge. Having said that, we know enough now, I think, to fix the problem of suffering. And compared to fixing the problem of suffering, I regard everything else as detail. And if you agree with me, well, get in touch. Perhaps consider getting your own YouTube channel if you write about it, social media. We need to get the abolitionist project mainstream. And that's why I write my stuff. I mean, the blueprints I draw up will never be implemented as such. Yeah, so suffering, the utopian dreaming will shortly become a policy option.
I mean, I think you bring up a very valid point. I'm Jewish, and in the Jewish culture, there's this idea of like tikkun olam, like leaving the world better than you found it. And I think that, you know, a lot of times we are afraid to take ideas to their extreme, but I think in this case, this might not be such. You also mentioned in your email to me that you were not baffled by the hard problem of consciousness, like this, how does consciousness arise from like physical stuff? But you were baffled by the binding problem, the phenomenal binding problem, how we take inputs and turn them into one experience. That is a huge flex. I mean, I've never met anyone who hasn't been baffled by the hard problem of consciousness.
Yeah, the hard problem of consciousness arises relative only to certain background assumptions. Now, I'm a hardcore physicalist. I think the world is exhaustively described by the equations of mathematical physics, quantum field theory. But the hard problem arises if one makes this metaphysical assumption that the intrinsic nature of the physical, the fire in the equations, is non-experiential. But if one drops this metaphysical assumption, then, well, with no evidence that the intrinsic nature of the world's fundamental quantum fields differs inside and outside the head. I think what makes animals special, it isn't consciousness per se, it's phenomenal binding, both local and global binding into unified subjects of experience. The question then arises, how is phenomenal binding possible? And if one looks at textbook neuroscience, then you are a pack of effectively decohered, discrete classical neurons communicating with each other. But I think, yeah, brains as normally understood lumps of cheesy porridge are an artifact of a false, naive realist theory of perception. I think that what naive neuroscanning suggests is phenomenal binding via synchrony, which merely restates the binding problem, is really binding via superposition. Superpositions are individual states. When you look at a cat, for example, you'll have edge detectors, motion detectors, color detectors, but I think these are individual superpositions. And it is this, the superposition principle, I don't think breaks down in the CNS or anywhere else. Now, there's a very powerful argument against this view as a solution to the binding problem, and it's that the effective lifetime of neuronal superpositions is femtoseconds or less, which is intuitively a kind of reductio ad absurdum of what I'm arguing. One person's reductio ad absurdum is another person's experimentally falsifiable prediction. And I suspect that when next generation interferometry can probe your CNS, it will discover not meaningless noise, but a perfect structural match. That the elusive structural match that nudges David Chalmers further towards dualism is actually, yeah, we'll find it in the underlying physics. So anyway, I'm, as I said, not mystified by the hard problem or the binding problem or the problem of causal efficacy, i.e., how is it that consciousness has the causal functional power to talk about itself as I'm doing now. I'm not mystified by are our computers going to wake up? No, they're not. They are the insentience of our machines is architecturally hardwired in a fundamentally quantum world. Decoherence makes classical computing physically feasible, but simultaneously prevents phenomenal binding. So even your notional whole brain emulation run on a classical computer, it would just be at most a micro experiential zombie. And this is relevant to the abolitionist project in that, yeah, it would be very different if our machines were capable of supporting phenomenally bound subjects of experience. But as I said, on technical grounds, I think this is not going to happen. I mean, one can speculate about future quantum non-biological quantum computers, but I don't think we have any reason to suppose that non-biological quantum computers in the fourth millennium will support a pleasure-pain axis or any form of experience as we recognize it. But that's a problem for another era.
I'm very curious. I mean, you're a hardcore physicalist, you said, but what? I mean, and yet you think that like computers can't gain consciousness, but if consciousness is something I think that just in the physicalist view is synonymous with, or do you think it's something that emerges from the brain architecture, or is it synonymous with the brain? Like for example, right? We were talking earlier about psychedelia. In an LSD trip, for example, where is that? Like, is that just something that's going on in the brain? I mean, do you think there is?
I think we need to get away from the standard conception of brains, which I think are an artifact of a mistaken, naive realist theory of perception. That if one wants to get into the heavy stuff, yeah, we don't live in four-dimensional space-time, we live in Hilbert space. If one is going to be able to rescue physicalism, one needs to solve the hard problem, the binding problem, the problem of causal efficacy. Naively, when I said that my best guess, and it is, it's my working assumption, I don't believe it. If one conjectures that the intrinsic nature of the physical, the intrinsic nature of a quantum field is experiential, then naively that might suggest that machines are going to wake up. But no, because what they can't do is phenomenally bind. That imagine replacing the ones and zeros of your notional whole brain emulation with discrete, decohered micropixels of experience. Now, execute the code as before. The upshot isn't going to be a phenomenally bound subject of experience, you. It'll just be a micro experiential zombie, just an aggregate of Jamesian mind dust.
But I don't think the decoherence view is the. I mean, in my conversation with Scott Aronson, for example, he was talking about how the brain is fundamentally like a wet, very noisy environment, and that doesn't leave room for quantum decoherence. I don't know if that is like the standard view, that like the quantum effects have a negligible impact on the
This,
brain.
yeah, I mean, the standards, well, this is it. it makes sense in general in life to find out who the experts are and then critically defer to their expertise. And in something like aeronautics or something like that, it's pretty clear who the experts are. In the case of consciousness and binding, there are no experts. Uh, 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 Eric Schwitzgebel came up with this term crazyism. All the options are crazy. Now, some theorists, notably Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, propose a so-called dynamical collapse theory, which is a modification of the unitary Schrödinger dynamics. But I don't think their theory really solves the binding problem, because even if individual neurons support quantum coherent states anomalously long-lived in their microtubules, 86 billion membrane-bound neurons with quantum coherent states would be a micro-experiential zombie, not a phenomenally bound subject of experience.
And so you don't think that like these micro experiential independent neurons could could emerge a total experience?
No, I mean, as I said, I assume physicalism, which means no strong emergence. Yeah, you've got to ultimately be able to derive everything from the underlying physics. And yeah, as I said, the obvious argument against the view I'm putting is the explanation of phenomenal binding. This kind of Schrodinger's neurons account is decoherence timescales, the scrambling of phase angles of neuronal superpositions. But it's the only way I know to save physicalism. Otherwise, how on earth does one derive what one is undergoing right now? Now, I'm using a lot of verbiage, and all the verbiage might suggest that I think I understand what's going on. I've said I don't. I am mystified by the existence of consciousness, which I conceive as the essence of the physical. It's my working assumption. I am mystified by this tremendously diverse palette of experiences. My working assumption would be that the solutions to the equations of QFT encode the diverse values of qualia, but we don't actually have a Rosetta Stone by which we could read these diverse textures off. Why do these experiences have the value they do? As I'm saying, I don't know. Tentatively, I explore an informationless zero ontology as a possible explanation of existence. Very speculative. I think we may be living in the quantum analog of the Library of Babel. Happy to chat about this on another time. Just drawing some strands together. I've speculated just the past few minutes on some very exotic territory, but when it comes to suffering, I think one can be pretty dogmatic that all involuntary suffering is evil. We have an obligation to get rid of it, and it will shortly be technically possible to do so, at least in our forward light cone.
Thank you for joining us, David Pearce. I really appreciated the conversation, and you're a really fascinating person to speak to.
Thank you again, Micah.